as a result of enacting land value taxation. Revenue in the long run will increase. And I think that that's something that any city could enjoy if they stripped away, as the delegate said, regressive taxation. I was pretty surprised to learn that, but it's, of course it's true, that the local income tax in Baltimore, or all the other counties, is a flat tax. And a flat tax is as bad as you can get as far as regressivity. It's 3.2%, almost as high as Philadelphia's at this time. Now, that might not be so bad in Montgomery County, and it might be not so bad in Howard County, but in Baltimore City, it's absurd that people that work for a living should have to pay an income tax. It brings in a lot of money, but it simply lets a lot of people off the hook. So we'll jump right into it, and hopefully I'll stop after a few minutes, and then we'll start talking amongst each other. So I'm going to get out so I can see the slides. We always do kind of a cob job. And you played the board game Monopoly, right? And you know...
You turn the lights down a bit because the screen looks very faint with all the lights.
I'm not in charge of the lights.
Okay.
Well, we're gonna...
Okay, here we go. Ralph's on it. We've all played Monopoly, and many of you know that Monopoly was actually based on Progress and Poverty by Henry George. And it was transformed over the years from a game of social and economic justice to a game of winner takes all. So how do you play Monopoly? The banker has all the money. You win by owning all the land and keeping all the rent. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And does this sound like Baltimore? Of course it does. And they're playing to win, these people that do their version of Monopoly. So every place has also, and this is where I think we come in, a community chest. And in Monopoly, of course, you get a nice thing if you land on the community chest, and it's a benefit to you. And the community chest is a descendant of what we're talking about today, the economic rent of land that goes into private pockets as opposed into the public purse that created it. So the community chest is sustainable, significant source of revenue, and it can be tapped. It is not tapped at this point, but it can be. Liberation as a word scares some people, but Baltimore needs to be freed. It needs liberation from the chains of distorting taxes and regressive taxes. And political rights, yeah, we've got them here, but it doesn't mean anything without economic rights and economic access. So change must come, and energy for change belongs to the people in the neighborhoods, not some person that lives in Cabin John in Montgomery County. Well, no disrespect to Montgomery County. So the goal is for Baltimore to control its own destiny. In a sense, we've got our professor of history here. In a sense, the power of the city grows as the power of the central forces and authorities start to shrink and to freeze up the wheels of national and state government. The state government is not treating Baltimore with the respect it deserves, and that's because Baltimore doesn't have any money to put up. Next slide, please. So we want to abandon antiquated practices and turn accepted wisdom on its head. And next slide, please. Insufficient revenue to address the need is a big problem. There's no money to pay for things that are essential. Now, people on talk radio, it's the best example, often say that playgrounds aren't essential, good schools aren't essential, paving the streets on a regular basis isn't essential. Of course it is. And a city can be, as Lindy said, responsible for its own revenue. So we know that Baltimore is taxed too much. And like we said, with Governor Hogan and his choice on the red line, the east-west rail, that help is not on the way. Help has to come from within. And this is how we think an idea could help. Okay, I'm going to get into some, I hate looking sideways, so I'm going to try to move here. There we go. Move around a little bit. Now, here is a problem right here. The median income of the city of Baltimore is $43,000 a year. That is, of course, very low. But what's most shocking, and something that we really have to get our heads around, is that in Howard County, which is a short Uber ride from here, or a bus ride from here, in Howard County, the median income is $110,000, Prince George is $76,000, and you can see that every other county except for Allegheny County, which is Appalachia, has a much higher median income. That, in a city that's depending to a great degree on an income tax, is nonsensical when you think about it. Next slide, please. So you see the income tax rates, 3.2%, 3.2%, 3.2%, and some close to that. That's a flat tax rate. So if you're making $10,000 a year and you're just getting onto the ladder of economic mobility and the economic ladder, you already have to give up to the state via the city a lot of your income. And of course, when you look at again, compare the incomes, the effective rate that's imposed upon people in Baltimore is much higher because of the lower income. Okay. Now, another problem that the delegate pointed out is that Baltimore is not worth much now as far as the market goes. Homes are not worth much, and the most expensive homes and businesses that are built are given tax abatements, tax subsidies from the state. So if you're going to build something pretty and nice, I used to live long ago in a neighborhood called Locust Point, and it was a pretty working class area at the time. We lived on Ford Avenue, and I didn't make much money then, even though I was doing this for a living. But homes were $90,000 in some neighborhoods in West Baltimore. You can get in Sandtown a house for not much because people don't want to be in Sandtown, Winchester. And we have to move that around. But here's another problem. That is a problem. This spot here, this orangish spot, is the combined property tax rate for Baltimore City. If you look at Montgomery County, of course, there's almost no county property tax rate. And in the rest of the state, it's about 1%. It's 2.36%, and pretty much that's an effective tax rate. In other words, that's what you really pay. So when you think about competition that the city of Baltimore is in with all the other regional areas, the DC-Baltimore corridor, there's no comparison. Your money doesn't go as far if you want to buy a house and live in a house. So you're, as a buyer, you're not going to be able to sell your house. If you're a builder, you're not going to be able to build a very decent house and a house that can happily house people. And the other issues are the fact that we've become, Baltimore has always been a deeply segregated city. And it's still that way. If you look at the percentage of African American and percentage of white residents split by census tract, you can see an absolute sharp line. There are articles have been written about it, classes are taught about it, and that's a problem. It doesn't bring people together, that's not a good thing. Next slide, please. And going along with that, because of the level of poverty in the city of Baltimore, whose people we are taxing, and whose small businesses are being taxed. The same thing, when you have owner-occupied housing, the predominance is, of course, Guilford, Roland Park, North Baltimore, up the Charles Street quarter, and then you get down to the Inner Harbor and Canton, and Bel Air Edison has a lot of homeowners. And then when you get to rentals, the rentals move to East and West Baltimore. Normally, we wouldn't object to rentals, but what's the problem with rentals in a poor city? The owners don't live in Baltimore City. They live elsewhere. They could care less what happens to the housing stock in a lot of neighborhoods. Okay, and this is really just more of, I think I made too much information for this presentation. But you can see the vacant units, again, they expand in East and West and Northwest Baltimore. And next slide. We can see that for the first time, I think it was in the past 15 years, there are more rental units than owner-occupied units in Baltimore. 30 years ago, less than 30 years ago, most Baltimoreans owned their own property. They owned their house. And that's very important, because if you own your own house, you're going to keep your neighborhood up to snuff. You're going to have eyes on the street. And like my city, Philadelphia, or other places, that doesn't happen. Once you have owner-occupiers drop as a ratio to rentals. Next one. And just this is just to let you know what the population breakdown of the city is. And there's a lot of young people, as we can see here. That's 0 to 25. Okay. So let's reappraise the effects of Baltimore's current tax system. When do taxes hurt or help? Slide. Okay, and here is a wonderful quote, which I'm not going to read to you. But essentially, what we're saying is that every time you increase a tax on something that is mobile, like work, like improvements.
Just a quick observation. One of the things that struck me about that quote is that it is saying that revenue, when it is invested well, benefits the city even though it does come from harmful sources. It would benefit the city that much more if it came from beneficial sources.
Yes. I mean, yeah, if we put in a speeding camera tax or fine, you're going to get the money. But what good is it doing to the body politic, to the community? And the next slide. And so what we're looking for is treating people with a light touch. And the tax collector does not in the city of Baltimore. And it's a problem that afflicts well-off people, and it afflicts certainly people that don't have the means and are struggling to find the means to make it in society. Okay. So instead of redistributing wealth, income, wages, sales taxes, what we want to do is help wealth retention for people and business. In other words, keep what you make, keep what you earn. It's a basic message of this school of economic philosophy. And it's not practiced in Baltimore. So we want to create opportunities for wealth generation everywhere in Baltimore. I'm sure we're all tired of, go to the Inner Harbor, and people forget about the rest of Baltimore. It's not right. It's a great town. This is kind of boilerplate. Incentives work, right? If you down tax condo development in Locust Point, you're going to do very well. People are going to put up lots of buildings. The builder is going to capitalize the abatement into a high sales price, artificially high sales price, and so Locust Point looks great. So, but incentives have to be universal. They have to be citywide. And we shouldn't confuse unwilling to pay with unable to pay. A lot of people get away with not paying their fair share of tax. We're going to get into that a little later.
That's an overly nice way of putting it.
I'm a nice guy. So, next slide. Okay, let's sort of dig into the facts. And I use, each of these are neighborhoods as designated by the city of Baltimore. Okay? So, that's what Baltimore is worth. This is what's exempt. And as you can see, it's about $4 billion. That's a significant share of ratio to the taxable value of land in Baltimore. Where is that exempt land? It's here. That's the stadium complex. That's the Inner Harbor. That's University of Maryland. And as you can see, our most at-risk neighborhoods, ones that we want to help, they have very little exempt land. And I'm going to get into the issue of exempt property in a little bit. Next. So we can look at Guilford. And those of you from Baltimore know that Guilford is a rather pleasant, sylvan neighborhood. Median household income by census blocks, it's very handsome, as you can see. $86,000 to $500,000 a year for a household. Next slide. And the land values are pretty high. The lowest is 400. It's one of those weird lots. But you also have areas of, that are condos and multifamily apartments that are worth very much indeed. Next slide. Now, there's an area called Middle East. Some people wanted to change the name. I was talking to Ms. Nia Redmond about that. She had some things to say. And the median household income for the whole area, as you can see, is $0 to $40,000 a year for a family. Now, how can people that don't make that income be asked to pay for a flat rate income tax? How can they be asked to pay 3.2% of their wealth that they have accrued in a house or land? Then, if you look at the house value of land, there's a few places, and they're in an area a little closer to Fells Point, so they're valued. But generally, the value is for a parcel of land, the taxable value is about $500 to $5,000. Really, it varies that much, but it's a very small amount of value. But the building, of course, is a higher percentage of the total value, and that's what we want to attack. Next slide. Again, if we look at the assessed taxable land values in the city of Baltimore, it's not a contest. Canton is the place to be, and that's where all the big condo units with where the Ravens, the Orioles live, that kind of thing. And then you have Guilford, Roland Park. And they all follow this corridor of Charles Street. And Charles Street is really a demarcation, if you will. Johns Hopkins is up around here. And again, when you get into West Baltimore, that's Highway 40, the interstate to nowhere, well known in Baltimore. And they have very little in the way of land value. So what we're leading to is really a suggestion that land value is not only a great resource for revenue, it'll give the vast majority of people in neighborhoods that can't pay the ability to chip in a little something. You always pay something on your land value, but we don't want them to be taxed on anything else. And as you can see, we have about $800 million a year in total taxes in property taxes in Baltimore. And of that, only $15 million comes from land values. So that is really a shocking figure. In other words, about 82% of all revenue comes from building values. What we want in the city, better houses, better neighborhoods, people willing to take a chance, roll up their sleeves, they get punished by a very high tax rate, almost the highest in the state. Well, it is the highest in the state. So, next slide, please. That underuse of land is really what we're trying to address. Now, we know that a land value tax, we're not going to get into the details now because we want to hear from you. Land value tax brings in the same amount of money as the city tax today. And what we want to do is get rid of the sales tax. It definitely sounds easier said than done, but it can be done. And sales taxes, along with the flat city income tax, are very regressive indeed. So it gets $350 million a year to the city, the sales tax. And that's nice, but it's not a reason to make Baltimore just like everybody else. What if Baltimore got rid of that sales tax? You'd have shoppers from Howard County and Anne Arundel and et cetera. They'd be coming into Baltimore City to shop, to make their purchases, because you wouldn't have a sales tax. And you would switch it to the property tax, now based on land, bring in not much more, 1.1 billion. I mean, it's statistically significant. But this would have far less deleterious and bad effects on the economy of Baltimore City than the current system. Next slide. So we decided to play with the income tax, and it's about the same amount of money. But imagine if you were struggling and living somewhere around Glen Burnie or Brooklyn Park, and you knew that the income tax was the same in Anne Arundel, and there wasn't an income tax anymore in Baltimore City. It makes sense for you to want to move into Baltimore City and take the chance of being a part of the resurgence and the revitalization and renaissance of Baltimore. If you were making a lot of money, you come into town anyway or leave town anyway because you enjoy those abatements and the subsidies. But the income tax difference would help bring people into the city by simply removing that penalty. And finally, coming down to the wire, I hope I was short. Homeowners in residential properties would benefit dramatically. Later on, if anybody wants to get into the dirty stuff, I can break it down by neighborhood and census tract. But the very poorest neighborhoods, the lower quintiles of values, would save the most. But overall, residential, which takes up 60% of the tax burden, property tax burden in this city, you can see there, they would see a decrease in their taxes. Those that do see increases are isolated to that same Charles Street corridor of people that can afford a little bit more on their land value tax, or a lot more, depending on your property. But they're going to enjoy an income tax cut or a sales tax cut. There's something in this for everybody, and the revenue is stable. And commercial goes up a bit. And industrial, it's almost pointless to even put it in because industry has left Baltimore to a great degree, but we have to show you what's there. So, next slide.
That's our last slide.
That's it.
Why go to the next?
Sure, if we can.
Where is it? Did you have a window open?
Yeah, I had it minimized. There's our Facebook page. Everybody sign up. It's called Baltimore Gold. And it's also called Baltimore Unbound. Some of you oldsters may remember that Rusk published a book called Baltimore Unbound in 1992. David Rusk. And his proposition, there we go to that, Baltimore Neighborhoods of Land. There you go. This is a live connection to a server in Billabong, Australia, I don't know. Not there yet. Good signal. There we go. Now, if this is something that after the conference, or actually during the conference, is going to be made available to the public. And that means that anybody in the city of Baltimore or elsewhere will be able to actually look at the deep data that we have here. This is the entire city, made nice for illustration purposes. Yep, you're gonna plug yourself in. Okay. And when we get the mouse active, I'm going to concentrate on Canton. There we go. Okay. Yeah, just roll the mouse over that. Click on it. So the current land value in Canton, would we all agree Canton is a pretty sweet place to live? I think so. It's worth over $500 million. It's a lot of money. And we, again, our plan is to put the revenue needs onto land value in Baltimore. So you can see where the shift would be. Now let's go right there. Beacon Park, I've been there. Winds Falls. The value of land is $253,000. So if you start depending on land value for paying for the city, you're giving relief to people who need it, and without the state or the feds coming to the rescue. Because I think we all acknowledge they're not coming to the rescue anymore. So, and all of our favorite neighborhoods in West and East, and even, Bel Air, which is actually a pretty healthy neighborhood all over. But the tax burden would shift directly to the Charles Street corridor. And that burden going into the Charles Street corridor would make the rest of the city stronger. Yes?
Josh, are these capital values or rental values?
I'm sorry?
Are they capital values or rental values?
Capital values. Yeah, interestingly, I should mention, we do have a thing in Baltimore called ground rent, which is a relic of the colonial era, really. And ground rent it's not really an analogy for land value tax, but there's a mechanism for reintroducing ground rent. That's what we're going to discuss during the rest of the week. But these are capital land values, and Maryland, for all of its faults, has a very good assessment system. It's a state system. It's directed by county bureaus. In other words, Baltimore City does its own assessments under the direction of the state. And in my humble opinion, and Ted Gortney's humble opinion, who is a colleague of ours and a very talented superstar assessor, they have good values. So that's essentially, you could even pick out your own neighborhood, and we could look. Now if we go to, let's see if we can go right. There's a right arrow up here. There you go. This is the tab system. So, for example, here is Pigtown, Washington Village. When I lived in Baltimore, it was called just Pigtown. Now somebody's calling it Washington Village too. But as you can see, it's a very low income area, and it's actually well placed. Washington Boulevard goes out. It's sort of the main route out to town on I-95. It's US 1. And I guess some of us will be going to the museums around here. And this is Martin Luther King Boulevard, Cal Ripken Way. But you can see that the city taxes are pretty low. Some of them are high for commercial and industrial property. But if we go to the next slide, LVT, base count, almost everybody, except for this one parcel, sees a reduction in tax impact, tax levy. And Pigtown, as we know, is teetering. It was fairly troubled in the late 80s, early 90s when I lived here. Sort of turned around a little bit. But it's simply hard to afford to live there when you have to put up with the problems of the area. So that's just an example of the shift. And we could do a lot more later on. I want to actually stop and start having a conversation and see if anybody has any questions. And Georgists and non-Georgists alike are welcome. Thank you very much.
Ed? What's the data on vacant lots in the city? I mean, we know that in Detroit it's huge. What percentage of the land in Baltimore is considered vacant?
I think it's about 20%. By that we mean vacant and abandoned buildings. And there's, on the assessment roll, there is a flag so that they're identified by the planning department as either vacant. So in a city of 270,000 parcels, 42,000 are vacant or blighted. It's not as bad numerically as Philadelphia, say, or Detroit, but it's percentage-wise right up there. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the flat tax as being one of the most unfair and regressive around. That doesn't hold a candle to what Margaret Thatcher tried to oppose in England with their so-called community charge or poll tax.
Well, that's true. I think Baltimore is grateful that Margaret Thatcher was not born in Guilford instead of Finchley. So yeah, absolutely, a poll tax was a disaster. Luckily, that's ended, except in some of the Pacific Northwest cities.
It was a disaster for the politician that tried to introduce it.
Yeah, that pretty much toppled Maggie.
Yeah.
Carl.
What percentage of the land rent is currently being taxed?
Currently, I would say maybe, and by rent we mean, you know, a capitalization rate of 6 or 7%. That's what I'm going on. It's about 0.5%, 0.5%. That's because they've learned to depend on so many other taxes that are certainly more efficiently brutal to collect.
Josh, there's been a lot of attention to the word value capture recently in the press. That word perhaps is even better known now among some people than land value taxation. Now, if we were to overlay the walkable areas around every single bus station in the city of Albany, usually about a quarter of a mile. That's the area that would be probably serviced best and would have the proportionately higher land value. What do you think that would do to our overall?
About this initiative yet, etc. I just wonder about the politics that might be surrounding the government officials.
Well, Tiger's not here right now. Mr. Rankin can maybe answer that, but what? What is it?
Minister Glenn Smith.
Sorry about that.
I just get away with it one time.
Okay, just that one time. But politically in Baltimore, right now people are aware of it. Mary Pat Clark, C4, you know, my pal on the radio. And there has always been nascent support, but there hasn't been any information for people to act on. As far as a powerful personality, at this time, this is my personal observation, is that there is not an operating philosophy right now in the very highest levels of Baltimore government. They've got a lot of balls in the air right now, and it's tough to think about the future. So it's up to citizens to push it, because I think that they're running on, just like in Philadelphia, they're running on emergency status, like Philly did for so many years. That's my personal view.
That last point I wanted to emphasize as well. I think in terms of public, from what I see in terms of public revenue philosophy, there isn't one. It's just sort of a panic situation. let's try something. So there might be opportunities for initiatives like this if they can catch on some public appeal.
There is a strong mayor in Baltimore City, but you have a new city council that really turned over the last election, and they're looking for creative ways to bring Baltimore back. So it's a good time to bring something creative and new to Baltimore, because they're looking for any creative way, because the old status quo has not worked for the neighborhood. When William Donald Schaefer was here, he was very invested in neighborhoods.
Yeah.
But then came a time when everything went in the harbor, all the investment. So now is a great time to, Mayor Q said that her focus would be the neighborhood. You know,
Yeah.
so
Let's do
great
that.
time.
Best news
I saw Polly.
Another question is, what about local media? Who is involved in the press who might be speaking out for it? I follow the Real News Network, but and they're right down the block from here, by the way. But who else?
Okay. I've contacted the Sun, and they haven't called back. But I do think that we're going to get some pull with a very popular, talented talk show host, Clarence Mitchell IV. And I've spoken to him on several occasions. And I think that he can get, it's one of the most popular radio shows, I think, in the state. And he was interested in it, and Tiger spoke to him a lot. And he's trying to offer ways to turn the city around. And he is also a member of one of the oldest, probably the oldest, political dynasty in Baltimore, the Mitchell family.
Hey, have you talked to the Real News Network? Because they're continually reporting on Baltimore issues, the police, all of this kind of thing.
No, I haven't. I didn't know who they are.
I've contacted them a few times.
Yeah, the most popular talk show, Larry Young, from
Yeah.
the OLP, he would be a great person to put that out there in that airway.
Larry
C4 is a little more conservative radio,
Yeah.
but Larry Young is more populist. I think he has a bigger listening on as well.
From the General Assembly area.
Excuse me?
Lindy, Brennan, just a question. Alana and I came in April to Baltimore and we met with a researcher at the university, and she's putting data together on ownership. And she said 3 things the finance department thinks about. And we must remember that Baltimore has lost 200,000 people since the 1960s. But we were talking after 2008, after the financial crisis of 2008. A couple of things she told us was that there's whole blocks of Baltimore that you don't know who owns them. Because when they had the crash in 2008, the finance department was so worried about its bond rating going down that what they did was they created a lien, so you can buy a lien on a property and you don't own it outright, but you're paying like the tax, the interest on that. The data itself is very difficult to find because you can only at the present time go in and find one owner owns this house and that house. Plus they use, I call them numbered companies. What's the American expression for a numbered company? It's not a name, it's limited liability. So it could be owned by the same company, but you won't know. But she's putting together the database. So the first thing was that the finance department will do anything to keep their bond rating. Secondly is that there was a tax. I think it's called the universal tax in Maryland, where you've got to equalize the taxation. If you take one up, you've got to take another one up. I'm not a tax expert, but we're hoping that this data will come out by this. And because one of the problems, is that if you don't know who owns the property, and somebody's speaking against it, you don't know who the opposition is. So there's some very interesting work going on at Baltimore at the present time. What was the name of the research? Can you remember, Lana? SEMA.
Professor
SEMA, and she's been funded by one of the heiresses to the UPS, the
Baltimore.
Anna's Foundation. Anna, what's the... My only comment there is that in addition to that, I want to make it more feasible to renovate these homes, so that people get an asset when they're done with it that they can benefit from and not be taxed on. So I would love to see a set of incentives moving on maybe from the community trust, land trust ideas that would make some of these abandoned buildings available to people to renovate with sweat equity and then own and then not be taxed on. Because the land, a lot of this land has negative value right now anyway. So.
There are 6 pilot community land trust areas now. Westport is one, Remington. So we're looking into land trust, community land trust as a way to get ahead of gentrification as well and keep housing prices down.
Community land trusts are first cousin, really, of what we're talking about. And maybe Ed can at some point talk about community land trusts that are scattered site, because that's what Baltimore has a lot of. In other words, not just 1 or 2 city blocks, but scattered sites everywhere. And I think that's a real possibility considering how many properties are owned by the city right now, and they don't have the resources right now to handle it. So they just mothball them and find a way for people to, Lindy said this, sweat equity, one house at a time, and you're a part of the land trust, so you pay your rent to the land trust, and you're not taxed on the building ever. That's the idea.
I was told that there is already a citywide land trust set up, but I yet to get particulars on it. I mean,
Yeah.
I had a presentation on it, but they haven't brought any concrete.
Well, of course, we want to make the whole city a land trust. I mean, because the land trusts have to acquire the land that they're going to administer, and that's somewhat like a lot of cases. So, and in this case, they have to acquire the rights and figure out who owns the parcels and all that sort of thing. So, we'd love to see that get streamlined.
Yes, sir.
So let me make sure I got this thing right. So essentially the land value tax is supposed to reduce the tax burden for the poorer communities, and meanwhile making the developers who are hogging some land and not doing anything with it, making them pay the value of the land as opposed to the value of a building that doesn't exist.
I think you put it pretty well there, yes. In addition, a lot of the absentee landlords that own a lot of this rental housing in the city would end up having to pay based on the location where their buildings are, and that wouldn't necessarily make them fix up the buildings, but it would take away some of the incentive to be an absentee landlord anyway. People would be more based in the communities where they are. It wouldn't fix all of those problems, but it would help move in the right direction on that.
Hey, I'm wondering if you have, in some of this data, have ever looked at the taxable value per acre. So like in this example, I think you were showing like total taxable value, the slide before this, and that top left-hand corner you said is either industrial or commercial, kind of big box store. Like when I've seen that data, it's taxable value per acre, basically the dense kind of urban neighborhoods tend to be really productive, whereas the big box stores like that, and maybe even where the Baltimore Stadium is, where the Ravens Stadium is, actually tends to be really low in productivity, even though if you look at total taxable value, it looks really high. When you look at it on a per acre basis, it's pretty low. And that gives you an idea of basically which style of development is financially productive. I'm wondering if you have any data on that or looked at that.
Well, I've certainly looked at it in the past, and when you look at value per square foot, that's a measure of what the zoning is. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. If you have something zoned industrial, like the Stadium Authority land, that's pretty much industrial, the value is very low per square acre or per square foot. And it's a measure of zoning. If the zoning is upzoned, I mean upzoning is the new hip phrase for what we have to do in our cities now. If you upzone, you increase the land value, and so the acreage price will be up. One thing that's important, I think, to keep in mind from our perspective is that we're talking about taxes. And taxes are ad valorem. They're not at all judged on the value per square foot. I mean, it's interesting information, and it can tell you a lot about a city, the health of a city. You'll always see a spike in value in the center city. But by doing taxes, we have to do it one way, legally only, which is ad valorem. So, in a sense, if you look at, if you look at this at Pigtown, that's a huge lot, and it's industrial, and it's worth probably maybe a couple of times more than a row home lot because of the zoning. So it's a distinction that I think we have to make. That's why the tax burden on that big plot is probably low, because it's zoned so low. Zoning is the law, it's the police power of the state. And zoning really trumps natural law and economics in a sense.
And were that lot to be upzoned and subdivided, it would still be in the same place.
But it would be much more valuable. Did that answer your question, or?
Yes, that answered. I work for an organization called Strong Towns. We have a lot of data on that, where we look at like 20 acres of a big box store and look at basically the value per acre of that, and then 20 acres of a core downtown. And that core downtown, 20 acres looking on a per acre basis, is 78% more valuable when you look at it on a per acre basis than the big box store out on the edge. And then to the point you made in terms of upzoning, in terms of being able to divide that up, when that big box store goes out of business, when that's no longer that kind of highest and best use of that property, what do you do with that? You know, it's at its peak economic, basically, value. There's not a better use for it unless you found a way to divide it up. This is what's going on in our malls. Vice versa, when you look at downtowns, those core downtown neighborhoods, even in kind of run-down neighborhoods, you can divide them up, and you can, if you have too much retail, not enough commercial space, those can be divided up and all of that stuff. So we see that basically everywhere. And then to this gentleman's question back here, one of the things that we see when we look at that data is that everywhere we've modeled that, poor neighborhoods subsidize wealthy neighborhoods. Kind of the core urban downtown neighborhoods subsidize the wealthy suburban neighborhoods everywhere we've looked. So it's just an interesting point.
Yeah, that's what our data in Baltimore shows, is that East and West Baltimore pay proportionately much more in taxes than they ought to or can.
Same for New York City.
When you speak, make sure to talk into the microphone there, because we can hear you, but if we're recording, so it'd be nice to have the audio for the...
Yes, sir.
Hi. I just have a question, I guess, about making this whole thing more politically motivating to the masses, because everyone in this room can talk about like taxes, and we find it somewhat interesting, but for most people it's not. So have there been any ways to make it more politically invigorating, like not talking about a land value tax, but maybe using the land value tax to raise funds to pay for some kind of income subsidy or universal basic income? And moreover, has it been possible to do that on a small scale to test it, like within cities and communities?
There has not been test of a guaranteed basic income in this country, and in other places it's funded by what we think are the wrong choices of revenue. If because all taxes and subsidies come out of land in the long run. So what we're trying to do is, we actually run some numbers for a basic guaranteed income in Baltimore that would come from the assessed land values that we have. And again, it would be helping the very poorest neighborhoods, clearly. And it would also make a lot of these downtown vacant lots, parking lots, etc., pay into that fund. So we've done that research. We don't have the time to just dump all this data. But if you get in touch with us, we have a Facebook page. I don't know if you've seen it. Just message Baltimore Unbound, and we'll get the information. We run the data on all kinds of things that we could do with extra revenue. You know, how much does a playground cost? Could be, I broke down the basic income on neighborhoods, on census tracts. So Sandtown, for example, would get an extra $800,000 a year as a community. And it would be theirs, you know, to decide what they wanted. You know, if they wanted to have a big blowout party, I suppose they could. But they would want to buy a playground, or they would want to, you know, put trees in. And so we'll talk, you know, we'll follow up, because we have a lot of ideas about how this actually would work in dollars and cents.
Another way I would propose, I don't know how many would agree with me, to make this a bit more politically motivating, is to pull the camera back and look at these issues in terms of basic justice. And when we talk about that, I think we have some points that are pretty easy to make. The land belongs to the entire community. The value of the land is created by the activities of the entire community. And these are points I think that we should always keep in mind, because we can always come back to them. Because I think we do have, as I said, basic justice on our side here. And that's something to not forget as we get into the specifics.
You know, this isn't being touted as a universal basic income. However, the state of Alaska for years has been giving, transferring some of its oil revenues to each resident.
Which some studies have said have increased land values in Anchorage, which I think is probably pretty likely.
I have argued not against the basic income, but a warning that if communities adopted this without getting the revenue from land value taxation from other sources, it will simply enrich landlords. And so what communities need to do is to use the revenue to build affordable housing. And that's really the key, because if you stabilize the housing costs in low-income households, then they will have disposable income to spend on other things that are necessary. So there's this direct link that I see between housing affordability and the basic income guarantee that has to work in tandem, or it won't work.
Well, that makes sense to me, but I would also be for spending some of this revenue on education and public services. You know, I don't think there's anything illegitimate about government. I'd like to see government work better. But that's just me. Yes?
Well, in Baltimore, affordable housing doesn't mean affordable at all. Most of the people in Baltimore City rely on private renters. If it wasn't for an investor buying a property and renting it out at a reasonable rate to people, nobody would have a house in Baltimore City. So, I mean, we do need to empower the smaller people like you guys to buy a house and rent it out in Baltimore City. That's the only way we're really going to attack that population growth. And I think that's where the LVT thing kind of piques my interest, is because you're encouraging more people to buy a house. By making it so that you're paying on the value of the land. Now you will go to a Berea and buy a house in Berea and rent it out. But I just wanted to mention that.
I think that's right, or you might live in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we might be starting to wind down here, folks.
suggested we take a little break because it's like we're being interrogated almost. Korean prison. But should we take a 10-minute break? And we can talk further after that?
So that we'll break into small groups and never broke into small groups. Oh, okay.
Yeah, we found, I mean, had one of the other memory cards, I don't know, I think we didn't format it or anything, we just put it in. Yeah, oh yeah. Do you, are you briefing me get
That's the first one.
Yeah, this is the first one. I put number 1.
Yes, we do. These little circular dots that you can come on and off easily, and we can use it to market, because otherwise we
Did you pause?
Okay, you're being good. I didn't know. I should probably give you a lesson on both of you on using the camera.
Are you still in the same place you used to be? I've been in the same house for 100 years. No, 50 years. 50 years, 1968. Time-wise, even if you're not that
One goes to 1 0, then something isn't connected.
Why do you need to?
Well, we don't use it in case something goes wrong and someone edits it. Now, of course, we're using a hardline feed from your board. In past years, if you remember, we had to change little double.
But if we're using, okay, so if I turn this off.
So here I don't have that. In past years, that could be a problem.
So that's what I'm wondering. I just turned off the receiver. So
Okay.